In this presentation, we are going to discuss designing and planning of teaching sessions. In this slide, you can see the learning outcome and the objectives of this presentation. You will see that we'll be addressing a key module learning outcome that is directly relevant to all educators, supervisors, or tutors, namely the designing and planning of learning activities appropriate to your workplace and role. So we are going to look at a lesson plan in detail, including the rationale underlying it, the steps in designing it, and finally, we'll look at some components that are likely to support or enhance active learning. So what is a lesson plan? A lesson plan is a guide for the preparation and implementation of an entire teaching session designed to achieve its learning outcomes or objectives. It can range from a simple checklist to a formal, detailed, structured plan. Good educators always have a plan in mind when they deliver a teaching session, even if it isn't a formal written lesson plan. In this presentation, we will focus on the constructivist approach to lesson planning, which will allow us to explore, build, and demonstrate learning related to the intended outcomes, using a shift from teacher-centered to a learner-centered learning environment. We are now going to conduct a little activity. Think back to the most memorable teaching session or lecture that you have attended or observed. What key factors made the session memorable? List 2 or 3 factors using your workbook. You can pause the presentation now to list the factors in your workbook. When you are finished, continue watching the rest of the presentation. You could come back to this step at the end of the session and check whether the factors you listed were covered or not. If not, then make a note to do some further reading. There are 3 general considerations to take into account in lesson planning. The first is the learning outcomes for the session. The second is the learners themselves. And the third is the practical requirements that you will need to deliver the session. The first step of the lesson plan is all about the learning outcomes to be achieved by the end of the teaching session. Bloom's taxonomy is very helpful for this purpose and suggests that learning consists of overlapping categories ordered in degree of difficulty, such that each category or level has to be mastered before you can progress to the next. You can see the 3 categories here: knowledge, attitude, and then progressing to skills. But note that learning outcomes may be provided to tutors from a previously designed curriculum. In this figure, you can see the pyramid of Bloom's taxonomy, starting from development of knowledge at the very bottom, going through its application, the ability to analyze and synthesize information, and ending with the ability to evaluate at the very top. Typically, a variety of verbs are used to depict the level of Bloom's taxonomy that will be addressed. So, for example, verbs such as define and list test the recall of factual knowledge, whereas verbs like explain, debate, demonstrate, or evaluate address higher levels of this pyramid. You could go back to the learning outcomes for this presentation on slide 2 to see how these verbs are used. More recently, it has been suggested that creating something based on what was learned is at a higher level than the ability to evaluate something. Some call this the modified Bloom's taxonomy. In step 2 of the lesson plan, the appropriate teaching method has to be selected for the session. Often this is predetermined, and you might be asked to give a lecture to a large group of students, or you might have an opportunity to teach a small group of learners at a patient's bedside. To choose the appropriate method, start by considering the factors such as group size, their past learning, their past experiences, any other characteristics of the group that might be relevant, your own expertise as a tutor, and the resources that you might need and those that might be available. Then consider the advantages and disadvantages of each method shown in the box to the right, and select the most appropriate method for you, the learners, and the context of your teaching session. Step 3 of the lesson plan is all about assessing your learners and their learning. What is the baseline level of knowledge and understanding they have or are likely to have at the start of a teaching session? How would you assess this? What are the learners going to be able to achieve realistically by the end of the teaching session? How would you assess whether the learning outcomes of the teaching session have been achieved? Make some notes in your workbook on how you might carry out this step. In step 4 of the lesson plan, we identify the resources that will be needed so that you can make arrangements in good time to have these available at your session. You could look at the physical environment, like the location, the room and its facilities, the time that you need for preparation and teaching, as well as the materials and equipment you require, such as flip charts or pens, journal articles, handouts, etc. The final step of the lesson plan is the evaluation of the session from the viewpoint of the learners, but also the tutor. In terms of learning achieved by the learners, was the lesson too difficult, too easy, or just right? Did the learners appear motivated? And if so, why or why not? Did the learners achieve their learning outcomes? In terms of the tutor, think about the session plan and the sequence of activities. Did they work well? Did the learners behave appropriately and as expected? Did they remain interested throughout and contribute fully to the session? Finally, here are some suggested activities to support and enhance active learning for students in your future teaching sessions. These include activities such as role play, case studies, peer teaching, debates, using a flipped lecture, or maybe conducting a demonstration followed by a discussion. If you're unsure about any of these terms, why not make a note of it in your workbook so that you can look it up later? So putting it all together, here's what a lesson plan looks like. A template for a lesson plan has been made available for you to download. When you have your next teaching session, try to use the template to create a lesson plan, applying the new knowledge you have gained from this presentation. Which level of Bloom's taxonomy will this be at?